And so it's necessary then to embark on this healing process for your own good, for the good of others. But eventually, the cool thing is, and we see this in our ministry all the time, and we've seen this in our marriage, as you heal, those wounds then become a resource for your love. So I take from so much more seriousness, because I come from a broken home, intentionality of healing, having a faithful love, having a holy love, not taking for granted that I have a home or marriage at any moment.
Now we have Bethany and Dr. Daniel Meola, such kind people. They run a ministry called Life Giving Wounds, which helps adults and young adults whose parents are divorced or separated give voice to their pain and experience healing through the wounds of Christ. And we just loved them. They had already knew who Mac Studios was and have been following our content, so it was really cool to get to know them. In this conversation, we talk about their much needed ministry, the summit, marriage preparation, and wounds and healing. I really enjoyed this conversation and getting to know the Meolas. So it's almost here. It's coming. The mini doc is on its way. So thank you for sticking with us in this series. Now, let's meet the Meolas and learn about life-giving wounds.
My name is Dr. Daniel Meola, and this is my lovely wife, Bethany Meola, and we are the co-founders of Life Giving Wounds Ministry, a Catholic nonprofit dedicated to giving voice to the pain of adult children in divorce and to bring them transformational healing in Christ.
That is quite the ministry. How did you, what was the impetus for starting that ministry?
We met at the John Paul II Institute for studies on marriage and family. We fell in love there and we got married. And Dan comes from a background where he is an adult child of divorce. For myself, my parents separated twice when I was growing up, but they reconciled. But for both of us, kind of through those experiences, felt drawn to help people who come from that background and really weren't seeing anything that was being offered in the church.
And yeah, just seeing this great pastoral need in the church. There's a lot of programs for the divorcees, but nothing for the adult children of divorce. So just really wanted to put love where there was no love. And I knew the journey of healing intimately from the inside. So I thought this is something that I could give back and share with others. And we would see what happens. And God has continued to bless it.
Why is that so different, adult children of divorce rather than, children of divorce in general, blanket statement?
So the folks that we are ministering to are all 18 and over. But they might have been kids when their parents split up, or they might have been older, and it's everything in between. The reason that we're addressing young adults and adults, there's two main reasons. One is that research has shown that it's often in young adulthood in particular that people who come from that background, their parents are no longer together, that's the first time that the issues really start to surface in a real way. The second reason that's really relevant to the conference we're at is it's also when relationships start and they get into serious relationships and maybe stuff comes up that they hadn't really realized was in their hearts or ways that they had been wounded. Or they have a lot of fears about relationships, fears about marriage that they hadn't realized till they get to that point.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever had a problem growing up, but often when you have a problem initially, you just try to get through it, right? And it's not until much later you reflect on what the heck just happened. And that's what we do as humans. So that's why we really focus on young adults.
Yeah, and a lot of times, especially in the first few years of marriage, but even, in marriage prep, that relationship with the other person really starts to bring out those things in you that you don't even notice about yourself until you see it mirrored in this person you love, who they're saying, hey, I don't like when you talk to me this way, or do you realize this thing about yourself? So how have you seen, engaged couples, and even I think those first few years of marriage when you're living together and actually starting to deal with marriage stuff, that you really start to realize, oh, maybe my parents' divorce affected me in a way I don't understand. How have you dealt with that in your ministry?
We go way back, to even dating. But you go back to friendships, any deep relationship, this stuff is going to start coming out whether you're aware or not. One way we talk about it is our expectations and view of marriage can be damaged. We really want a strong marriage, but like how we approach it is not necessarily the best way. And I can see this in a cynicism, unfortunately. Like, and again, I'm not talking about those who've entered into marriage. That's a huge step. I always applaud that. I'm like, good for you, especially if you come from a broken home. That is an incredible step to take. But stepping back, there's a lot of fears. There's the fear of rejection. There's the fear of abandonment. When you come from a broken home too, you can see, okay, this was messed up. I really want something else. And you think the relationship is going to fix all your problems. So I can also see like romanticism. A lot of people can escape into relationships from broken homes as well. So there's that romanticism piece. And so there's different ways in which people can deal with their wounds, but neither is healthy. And the church presents a third way between cynicism and romanticism. And that's the reality of both the cross and the resurrection together in relationships. There's immense joy, immense healing, immense love, but also growth and sanctification and self-sacrifice, growing in how we need to be healed in our wounds, stuff like that.
And so if you're describing this to, say, someone who's dating, because I like that you mentioned that, because that's almost like if you don't get past that, it's a non-starter, right? Like if you have failed relationship after failed relationship, then that cynicism will really start to set in. So how does this idea of self-sacrifice apply to someone who's single and dating and seeking to be married?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of our ministry, we're looking at how can these wounds be healed for adult children of divorce? How can Christ enter into these places that are broken and help people regain their sense of identity, their sense of being loved? We really go back to the root, because for everyone, no matter what stage they're at in a relationship, it wants to be able to look at these wounds and find that healing. Looking at their own identity, we've been talking a lot about the baptismal call. We like to go down to the baptismal identity of knowing that we are a beloved son or daughter of God. Starting from there, and then we also talk a lot about what we call self-protective behaviors, that often if someone comes from a home where there was chaos, where there was broken trust, broken relationships, there's a lot of things that can creep into their own life as a way to protect their hearts. And that could look like not wanting to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is very scary. It could also look like, keeping people at arm's length, leaving relationships when they get difficult to make sure that you're not rejected. We try to help people both examine where are those places that they might be putting up those barriers that make it harder to be in those intimate relationships. And then seeking out the virtues that can help them grow past that. The virtue of courage to be open in a relationship. The virtue of humility to let people do things for them. Because oftentimes it can be a stance of really strong independence, to not be dependent on another person, and move past those self-protective behaviors to that self-giving love that we know is at the heart of marriage. And it can be a process to get there. And that's a lot of what we try to do to help shine the light on these things, not in a way to shame anyone, but in a way to say, like, I want this love that I know the Lord has for me, and how do I get there?
I remember very distinctly in my own healing journey, because I went through several failed relationships, and just shout out to those who've gone through failed relationships. I know it's hard. It sucks. It's incredibly despairing once you've had those repeated ones, but there is hope. They offer a lesson. And I remember going back looking at, okay, what's the pattern? I saw there was a pattern. For me, I was living out this savior complex. So I was really attracted to people I had to really take care of that were really broken, which, again, nothing wrong with broken people as long as they're on the path to healing. Like, you have to be on the path to healing in a healthy relationship. Like trying to do everything for the other, that's not healthy. So that was my brokenness. I had to own my own moves, see that pattern, and then work to a relationship and date somebody who did things for me and receive and be dependent and allow that reciprocity, which was my wife. Like, it was the first truly reciprocal dating relationship. And I've said this a lot, like, people are like, oh, was it love at first sight? Like, okay, there's attraction. There was. But it was uncomfortable. It was really uncomfortable at first sight, because she was so unlike any of my other girlfriends. But I knew through my healing work that this was a good thing. This uncomfortableness was proceeding from something good, not a red flag. And so those who've gone through some failed relationships out there, like, look with Jesus Christ in prayer. Is there a pattern? that's unhealthy and try to do the opposite.
So your perspective as something like this is wildly important, right? Because, or at least maybe from my perspective as an outsider, because you were speaking to the brokenness that people are experiencing even before they get to some of these preparation stages. This is what they're going to bring to the table that needs to be talked about and parsed through. So what are you thinking as you go into these small group sessions where these discussions that you're the only ones who are sort of advocating for this huge part of the population that is coming into the church and marriage?
That's absolutely our passion. I mean, thankfully, there's so many more people in the church now that are having that mindset of seeing the wounds that need to be healed, which is a great direction to go.
We're here really advocating in the church, like to have healing at all processes, like heal now, but have a healing as part of evangelization, as part of marriage prep years after. I mean, we're big advocates that like healing needs to just be part of your walk of life until the day you die. Like, and that's also like the thing is to normalize healing too. Like it's not something you have to be afraid of. Like people are really afraid of looking at their wounds. But eventually the cool thing is, and we see this in our ministry all the time, and we've seen this in our marriage, as you heal, those wounds then become a resource for your love. So I take from so much more seriousness because I come from a broken home, intentionality of healing, having a faithful love, having a holy love, not taking for granted that I have a home or marriage at any moment.
That's awesome. You know, I've been to a lot of young adult group stuff. I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about healing your own wounds, even when you're single like that, or even when you're in the dating experience, like doing that as a part of your young adult formation. So even that is just really, really beautiful.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's because a lot of people are just so focused on marriage and almost what this summit is trying to help people think more deeply about. Like, that's not the end goal. Like, there's so much formation in yourself that needs to happen for you to have this lifelong vocation if that's what you're called to.
Right.
And so I think that really like people are just looking to that point, and so they gloss over any type of healing, any type, because mental health is a big deal nowadays. So I think our generation embraces that language, but they don't know what to do with it in a Catholic space because it makes it seem like, ooh, ooh, I can't heal or something like that, you know?
There's a stigma, I would say.
Total stigma.
Both in and outside of the church, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
But the way that y'all describe it is not. It's just
No.
a part of it, you know?
It's part of the good life, I think.
Yeah,
I'll
it's
go
what
so
you do.
far. Yeah. It's what you do as Christians.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, we know it takes courage to go there, like to go into those difficult parts of your life. We know we have people who come to our retreats who say it took them, a couple years to kind of feel like they were ready to embrace that and talk about it and kind of reflect on it with God. And the fruits that come from that are so incredible, but we always just affirm everyone because it really does take that courage.
Because that's something we talk about too. Like there's our healing, which is our response to the wounds, but there's aspects of the wounds that are outside of our control. So like our parents' relationship, any dysfunction that comes up, like that's going to keep happening even after the divorce, separation, at every holiday. Like that's out of your control, but we can control our response to that better and better. But that also means then you have an ongoing suffering. Like, so you need those tools for healing to weather that together as a couple. And again, the suffering can come up in other ways. Like we experience the wound of infertility. So like maybe it's not even a broken home, but as you do that healing from one wound, that becomes a resource for healing another wound. And that's the thing. The healing is part of the good process. Like some of my most beautiful moments with my wife has been crying together. Like you just cry, like the grief and like the wound we face, like with my broken home or the family or the infertility or whatever. Like I don't wish that on anybody, but like to cry together with her and to have that bond of grief and love, like that was a form of love. And that's united us and it's made us who we are today. So it's kind of, it's part of the good life. And we don't think of it in that terms, but that's the gospel. It flips on the head. What is once seen as something bad, problematic, just to get rid of, can become a reason for rejoicing.
I mean, around half of the couples coming to marriage prep are at least one of them is going to be coming from a broken home, statistically speaking.
Wait, here, just to clarify what we mean by broken home, not just divorce, separation, cohabitation, dissolution. 51% or more of children today are not being continuously raised by both of their biological parents. So it can be because of any number of background.
Yeah. So thinking of doing marriage prep, having that in mind, kind of our dream would be to have something specifically for those couples. So talking about conflict and not just talking about the skills, but talking about the immense fear and anxiety that conflict causes because they saw it go so poorly in their families of origin. Talking about finances, not just all the, ins and outs of how to, handle your finances well, but the severe anxiety that can come, especially the many, many children whose status of living plummeted after their father left. It's a pretty common story. So just having a way in marriage prep to individualize and personalize for these couples with backgrounds like this so that those topics can be brought more to the fore and made more particular. And that could be just some very specific discussion questions or whatever their conversations are with their mentor, just bringing these things into light as an opportunity to talk it through in a more specific way.
I could say a lot. Like, just don't be afraid to be authentic and vulnerable and wounded. like if you want true intimacy and knowing your future spouse or the dating partner, like gradually you have to do that. Okay, not on the first, second, or third date, right? Like, there's a gradualness. That person does have to earn your trust. But by the time of engagement, but even into marriage, because we won't perfectly communicate and there'll be areas we need to keep revealing of ourselves well into marriage. And to now, if you're married, to see those wounds are shared wounds, to work together, to process. And that's the beautiful strength of why marriage can be healing and turn those wounds into resources. And we see that perfectly modeled by the way, by Christ. He's fully vulnerable on the cross, fully trusting of his father. He's speaking to his father. He knows his identity. Even though he's wounded, he knows he's not reduced to those wounds. And he gives love from that, from those wounds. Those wounds, like our name of our ministry, can become life-giving. We see that par excellence on the cross. So if you feel wounded, Christ is right there with you.
Obviously, your work is wildly important, but I'm just so excited to see what comes from your work in particular with regard to this summit, because it really can transform households, communities. We've been talking about that a lot, but this is such like at the core of, one issue that is not going to go away. It's going to keep presenting itself in a lot of different ways. So thank you for chatting with us. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mac Studios.